Chairs. All right. So when Andrea first asked me, funny enough, this was a day off, but anyways, that's okay. I love coming and doing this kind of stuff. And all my kids are sick and sleeping in anyway, so who wants to spend time with them? So when Andrea first asked me, we said there was some talk about, can we do some breakouts? And then we were told you were going to be sitting on a bunch of really close together chairs, and you're pretty uncomfortable, I imagine. So I was like, okay, I'm going to try and just keep you really entertained for about 2 hours. And so I'm going to do a lot of talking. And I will easily fill 2 hours, and then it'll just be like this. We'll be over. But if anybody has any questions at any point, please put up their hands. A couple of times, I'm going to throw out any ideas that people may have. What some folks may find as when I am talking over the next couple of hours, you may start to find that you're thinking about yourself, one of your students, one of your kiddos, maybe your partner, maybe one of your actual children that you are raising. And if that little light bulb goes off and you want to reflect on that, please put your hand up and reflect. Because if something's coming up for you as we talk about this, chances are it's coming up for somebody else, and maybe you're the one that feels that you can ask the question. So very informal. Please interrupt if you want to. If you are uncomfortable, or if you have to walk around because you've got a broken foot or ankle and you're sitting here in the front row, I did offer her a footstool. She said no. But if you need to get up, just do. I understand that people need to regulate. I'm not going to throw anything at you, okay? So when I first started doing this stuff, I have been practicing for, I don't know, now 27 years, I think I've been in practice. I've never actually worked in a school. It's really important. Practicum, we all had to work in a school as a practicum. I am from a family of teachers, mainly high school teachers. But when I started working in corrections. That's where I was, working with kids mainly in the criminal justice system. So youth from the ages to 14 to 18. And at the time that I started practicing, and that was when I was actively doing my PhD, I was also working at a mental health clinic. We had this real focus on just how do we fix? How do we look at the symptoms and how do we fix? And we knew 25 years ago that we started to realize that some of the pieces that we were trying to fix seemed unfixable, right? And so a lot of the research that I did and a lot of the work that I did was trying to figure out why these folks that needed us so much didn't seem to want anything that we were offering. And what I have learned over the last 22 years, because I fell upon this stuff now almost 23 years ago, was the first time that I heard someone speak about neurodevelopment after trauma, right? Or how stress impacts the brain. And that was the first moment where I went, I have to look at the world differently. Because what I'm seeing in front of me is a collection of all the experiences that youth or that adult or that young child has had, and the experiences that maybe their parents have had and the generation before has had. And then you start to understand where those stresses can come from. And the stresses can come from the home, unfortunately. It can come from the community. It can come from the history. It can come from the systems. And then that is what they bring to us, but they just look wonky. And so my goal today is to help make, for those of you that are maybe sitting with one of those kiddos, big or little, because I think you all have some different roles in here. I've got some ECEs, I've got teachers of adults, right? I've got admin, do I have like folks working in all of it, custodial, all this kind of stuff? Woo! I love that. And I really do. I'm not just saying that because I want people to feel good. One of the importance about trauma-informed approaches is that it is no person left behind, that we come together as a collective and we realize it is village. And if you are a teacher in a village, great. If you're the custodian in the village, woo, we need you too, right? And that the way we can create safety for individuals coming into our spaces lands on all of our shoulders. And so my goal for you over the next 2 hours is that some of you feel that same excitement of being able to say, I'm going to take a look at the person on Tuesday, because you get Monday off. On Tuesday, I'm going to take a look at the person that I really wished had moved to Florida over the weekend. Though who wants to move to Florida, seriously? But maybe somebody does. And I'm going to look at them with renewed hope and renewed optimism. That is my goal. okay? And so when we start to think about how we get to that goal, we're going to focus on two things today. We're going to focus on understanding regulation, and I'm going to dive deep into it in a really, hopefully, fun way for those of, has anybody actually heard me speak before? Oh, you have. This is also very exciting because I use really old jokes, and if you've heard me speak before, you have to hear them again. I apologize. But I have all fresh ears, so I'm going to tell them like they're brand new, and they're not. But we're going to get really into regulation in a fun way. I'm going to try and make trauma as fun as I possibly can, even though there's nothing fun about it. And then we're going to talk about how critically important you are. And those are the two focus for today, is how do we understand how to regulate, and how do you pull it all together to be the rock star relationship that you probably signed up to be when you first started this job. But sometimes we don't look so good, but we'll get there. So this is the less than fun part. And I do promise you on a Friday you will leave feeling good. The next 10 minutes feels a little heavy, and if at any point anybody needs to take a break, get up, right? If at any point anybody starts to feel triggered, just get up, take a breath, walk out, because we are going to talk a little bit about what folks do experience. Because the reality is trauma is everywhere, right? So many years ago, and some of you may know this study called the ACEs study. It's become quite well known. But this was probably 20 years ago now, that the ACEs study came out. Now, ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. What those adverse childhood experiences were in this study were about 10 things that could happen to somebody in their first 18 years of life. Now, it was a really interesting study because they weren't actually interested so much in trauma. What they were trying to figure out was why certain people continued to use the physical healthcare system. These guys were really interested in the physical system, and I think they were actually obesity researchers, or one of them was. And so they're trying to figure out why are people using the physical healthcare system so much, and is there any relationship to the possible stresses they may have experienced when they were children? And so they took 10 things, and these are 10 things that just their stats suggested were the right 10 ones to ask. It doesn't incorporate a lot of the things that we now understand are what we call adverse community experiences, things like racism, marginalization, system biases, historical, long-standing trauma. It included sort of the 10 things that would probably happen in your home. And so this was things like sexual abuse, emotional abuse or neglect, having a parent that was incarcerated, having a parent that had a mental illness, having a parent that had an addiction, and so on and so forth, right? And they put out this questionnaire to 25,000 homes across the United States and asked people to just score it. What is your score? And you can do that today. You could go online and say, what's my ACE score? And you'll see the original 10, and your score is anywhere from 0, if you've had none of those things, to 10, if you've had all of the ones that are on the list. 10 is pretty unheard of, I'll be honest, but I'll just give you an example. In our Indigenous communities, some of the numbers are around 8, right? And so what they found on this ACE questionnaire, and this is the first time anybody had sort of looked at it that we knew of, and when I say looked at it that we knew of, because there could have been someone in a significantly less well-funded institution in a different country that doesn't get money from drug companies, and they may have been looking at the same thing, but we never found out, right? Or it was a woman sitting somewhere, and we didn't get to know their research. But what we found out about these two white guys that did this research is that there is a whole bunch of trauma out there. And it's really important that it was a very protected population that ended up returning the questionnaires. So the vast majority of the 25,000 respondents were white and were middle class, which we do know provides protection for whether or not you're going to experience some of those ACEs, right? Without, certainly in this continent, without marginalization and oppression, we are not expecting those community traumas to impact the family, right? But these folks were protected, and even still the rates of trauma were higher than anybody had ever suspected they were. And fascinating things started to happen. There was one woman, 82 years old, her ACE score was 1, but it was sexual abuse. And she wrote and said, on top of her questionnaire, she said, I want to thank you for asking me. I have lived my life fearing I would die with nobody knowing my secret. And it was this beginning to have this understanding that people are carrying this stuff and no one is asking about it. And then they started saying, what is the ACE score like in terms of how relevant it is to how healthy we are as adults? And there is a huge relationship. And this relationship has been retested and has now been done, last count was like 53 countries all over the world. And in every case, the relationship is the same. What you experienced as a child impacts you as an adult, especially if we don't understand that's what's happening. And that's the really important part, especially if we don't understand what is happening. And so what they saw generally is that an ACE of 0, 1, or 2, now there were some exceptions, some of those ones can be big ones, but generally speaking, if you were a 0, 1, or 2, you are no more likely as an adult to be using the physical healthcare system for things like cancer or diabetes or COPD. But if your ACE score was 3, you were significantly more likely to be using the physical healthcare system for things that seem unrelated then. We now know have a lot to do probably with inflammation, which is stress. And that is things like diabetes, cancer, COPD. If you were a 4, you were far more likely to now start to have mental health diagnoses, be struggling with addictions potentially. As we creep up, and this is like almost like the tipping point is a 7, you are exponentially more likely to be using the healthcare system for things that seemed completely unrelated to trauma. No one was there for PTSD, right? They were there for things like unplanned pregnancy, right? They were there for things like, as I mentioned, diabetes. What else do we know? We know things like early paternity in youth is related to it. Pregnancy loss is related to it. Multiple pregnancies that are unexpected or unplanned is related to it. Whether or not you're going to be diagnosed with any mental illness is related to it. So your chances of even being diagnosed with something like schizophrenia is higher if your ACE score was high when you were 0 to 18. And so people started to say, I think this might be really relevant. We should probably look at it. And so what is really out there? Well, we know, my ECE folks in the room, we know that about 1 in 4 kids start kindergarten, right, having experienced something potentially traumatic. And what I mean by potentially is it doesn't necessarily mean they've been thrown off the rails yet, right? And we're going to talk about what that looks like. But they've experienced something in their life potentially very stressful. Now, maybe this is a single episode event. Maybe they've had a death in the family. Maybe they have been in a hurricane. Maybe they've been in a fire. Maybe they've been in a car accident. However, if they are causing some issues in your room and you're having some little behaviors, chances are it's one of those traumas that are probably on the list. It's things like they are witnessing domestic violence in their home, right? Or they are experiencing emotional abuse, they're experiencing neglect, they're experiencing community stuff that is getting in the way of them being the 4-year-old that they want to be. 1 in 4. In certain populations, that is much, much higher, right? By the time that little 4-year-old becomes a 16-year-old, we're looking at about 60 to 70% of kids have experienced something potentially traumatic. And this now starts to include violence because of their race, their religion, their gender identity, their sexual orientation, violence in their intimate partner relationships. This is what we see, about 60 to 70% of kids. And so when we start thinking trauma's there, we have to start looking for those ACEs. And so I've talked to you about how the ACEs impact big adults, right? But what about kiddos? So what we see is when we control for everything. We control for race, we control for social economic status, which is what postal code you were born into. When we control for all those things in research, saying we're going to take out the impact of all of those very, very powerful predictors of things because of the system we are living in, we still see that the kid's ACE score is the number 1 predictor of whether or not they're going to come to school, right? Why is that so relevant? Well, I used to work in corrections. You know, the number 1 positive predictor that a child avoids having that path, right? It's being in school, right? You're an incredibly powerful predictor of long-term success. And what's really fun fact, that is regardless of when that person enters school, right? How many folks have 50-year-olds that you are teaching, right? Exactly, put your hand, be proud of it, right? That 50-year-old is now on a trajectory that is going to have a different life, not just for what they experienced, but for what their children and grandchildren will experience, right? The power of it is immense. And the number one predictor of whether or not they're going to show up is their ACE score, right? We also know in kids, it is the number one predictor of whether or not they're going to be referred for any type of behavioral health concern. Now, how many of you have read an OSR and seen the top thing that says, I think this might be trauma, right? How many of you have read an OSR that says ODD, ADHD, conduct disorder, blah, 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 blah. Sorry, I spent a lot of money learning how to diagnose, and a lot. I don't do it much anymore because we put labels on folks that are struggling that don't necessarily help us understand how to help them, right? Sometimes they're beneficial. A lot of times we're missing what's actually going on. The other really incredibly important one for me, and we're going to focus on that one today, is there a direct relationship between how many ACEs are in your setting and how well you are doing. So I'm going to give you a hint. If you're an adult education teacher, there's a lot of them, right? I know a lot of kiddos that I've supported in finally getting into adult education or getting into the adult education system. They have not had easy journeys, right? And so understanding that your wellness is related just to being in the room with folks that are experiencing trauma, and I'm going to get to that, don't worry, is really important, because today we're going to understand that you are the most important tool for helping those folks be successful, but you looking after yourself is the first part of that. And so understanding that trauma sort of gets a little contagious, right, is really important. We also see that trauma is related to all sorts of learning-based concerns, right? Trauma starts to alter the way a child can manage stress. Trauma can start to alter the way the brain processes information, and because of that, we begin to see things like increased learning disabilities, significantly lower achievement scores, even if they're very bright, right? And I think that's really important. Lots of concerns with language problems, lots of concerns with things like narrative memory. Can they tell you the story? Can they get it from what I always say, the train station down onto the paper through the train tracks? Not all the time, right? And so understanding that the way that their brain has had to survive is impacting how they're doing in your classroom or in your setting is what this slide is about. And then, as you can imagine, these are the folks that spend a lot of time with our special education folks, our support services, right, our CYWs, all along their journey, until potentially, because of the room we're in, they maybe drop out at 16 and then come back to you when they're 25, right? Any questions on that? All right. So I have a little motto, and this is where we're going to go from here. I have a motto that I've developed over years of working with folks, and now I run a trauma clinic, and so obviously I'm inviting, like, come, if you've had trauma, come, we like you, come on. But over years and years of working with folks, I have often seen people feel very hopeless, right? And we actually know when we look at sort of high ACE scores, so for example, our Indigenous communities where there's high ACE scores, it goes with a sense of hopelessness, right? That nothing's going to change. And so we feel this sense of hopelessness, and I often have. And often when we feel hopeless, we try and maybe throw a million tools at folks, or maybe we just say, I can't help you, right? What I have learned is that if we increase our understanding, and it means our understanding of what's happening in the room in front of me, our understanding of what's happening inside of myself, and the understanding of what that journey might have been like for that person, we understand what we need to do next. We start to feel better about our jobs, regardless if we're secretaries or custodians or ECEs or teachers or administrators. And then we start to feel hopeful, and that is contagious. People will often say to me, and I have done literally very little after one of these sessions, other than saying, yeah, I think I get this, right? Here's some things that might be going on. People leave saying, I feel hopeful. And I'll say, well, I actually don't know if I can help you yet, but we're off to the right start, right? And that is that sense of, I think someone understands that I'm trying as hard as I can. You are not going to get a bunch of tools from me this morning, right? Some people always want to say, I want tools. I'm going to give you the most important one, though. I'm going to give you a lens to look at folks, to be able to see yourself and them, and be able to take that giant step back and say, what do I think is going on here? And I guarantee you that tool will be the most important tool you use. It's the most important I use. Any questions? All righty. So what do we need to understand? I'm going to put this down because I'm going to get all dramatic. So I don't want to fidget. So what we need to understand is that trauma impacts regulation. So when we talk about trauma, I want you to just imagine it's stress. Everybody has experienced stress. What makes something a trauma is when it is such a large stress that it starts to alter the way someone acts and behaves following the event, right? So people can experience a potentially traumatic event, but if we wrap around caregiver support and they didn't have certain thoughts at the time and they're well-resourced in terms of all the things that they can access, the chances of developing, say, PTSD are actually very, very low. But what we begin to see with stress is that when someone is having lots of it, for example, the little 3-year-old who's watching their parents fight, right? That stress starts to alter the system, and that's when things start to become traumatic. Now, understanding how it alters the system, I mean, I'm sure folks have heard things like flip their lid, so their amygdala, that part of the brain that does fight, flight, freeze, it's really on fire. That's a lot of what trauma does. But to understand what it looks like in your space, it's understanding how we regulate and what regulation looks like when it goes wonky. So I'm going to walk through this. This is my model. Never tested, I got to tell you, other than with lots of human beings that I work with, but never tested in research. So if anybody's going to get worked up about this is not evidence-based, it's not, but it's really evidence-informed. And the evidence is the people that hang out with me on a day-to-day basis and myself. And so my goal for this model was, how do we put all this complicated information about trauma's impact on the brain and how we regulate and attachment and the importance of relationships and put it in a little simple thing that we can all go, oh yeah, I get that. That's the goal for this. So I'm going to walk through it, and then I'm going to tell you a story, and then I'm hoping we're all on the same page at the end of it. We will be, because everybody's done what I'm going to do at this story, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. In the pyramid, okay, you may recognize the categories. A lot of the categories are from the voluminous amount of research being done right now on regulation. People like Stuart Shanker and the Canadian Self-Regulation Institute, which is now the Merit Center, working with folks with autism, with fetal alcohol, trying to understand how the brain is impacted. They've come up with a bunch of categories that sort of say there's a lot that our brain has to do. They didn't invent what the brain has to do, they just categorized it. And so they sort of talk about, at the top, well, the top of my pyramid, we've got this pro-social regulation. That means, for me, am I a good kid? Do I look like a good kid, right? And that really is what it means. You're never going to read a book that says this is a good kid, but oh my goodness, when you read what it is, it's like, yeah, this is a good kid. Like, that's what we would call this kid, regardless of age. It's the person that shows empathy. It's the person that follows the rules. It's the person that gets all their paperwork done all the time, doesn't worry about their college phoning and finding out how far behind they are, that kind of stuff. For most of us, we do this on a day-to-day basis. When folks stop doing this, we start to maybe wonder what's wrong with them, and we want to be really careful we don't start judging at that moment. Because how we do this and how well we do this has a lot to do with things going on below the pyramid. And that's the way the model works. The top is what we may be able to show if we are supported at the bottom, but when we see someone not being a good kid, regardless of age, I want to get curious about what's going on underneath. Because here's a fun fact, I've never met anybody that woke up in the morning and is like, my goal today is to be a dick. That's what I want to do. And I've worked with all sorts of interesting folks, right? All sorts of them. But that was never their goal. Now, there's probably someone out there. I think sociopaths, like true sociopaths, are about 0.01% or less of the population. They may wake up having that thought. But the vast majority of folks wake up probably believing that they can't be a good kid, not wanting to be a bad kid. And so when we see someone struggling with pro-social regulation, go lower. Social regulation, well, that's our peers, right? It's not our safe relationships. It's not our intimate relationships. It's our colleagues. It's our friends, right? It's not our super close friends. It's teenagey friends, right? It's like the ones that you think you're friends with, but then if you wear the wrong pants or you date the wrong guy, maybe you're not as good as you thought you were with that person. For a lot of folks, this is a huge pressure. For a lot of folks, being able to navigate things like bullying and do I feel safe coming into social situations. And sorry, this is a new watch and it's yelling at me, so let me just figure if I can turn that off. probably bothering no one but me. And so this is a pressure. For some of us, it's a strength. Where are my extroverts, right? We like hanging out with people. I am a huge extrovert, right? I talk to myself in the car if no one's with me. And I actually stopped at a stoplight once, and one of my friends was beside me. He's like, I was trying to get your attention. You were too busy talking to yourself, which is very embarrassing, except I love that human being, so I was okay. But we like this. It puts gas in our tank, right? It's a strength for us. But for a lot of our folks, it's a pressure. And they constantly have to navigate those social relationships, right? And if we see challenges in social relationships, bullies, right? We start to riskily say, what's wrong with you? But again, I want to think, struggling with social regulation, let's go lower. So let's go one lower. Cognitive regulation, it's a big one, right? This is what our frontal lobe does. This helps us do things like process language, which you're doing a lot of right now. I am a fast talker. This is me trying to talk slowly, and I really do try, and it's being recorded. So if you miss most of it, you can put it on slow and listen to it again. And I apologize for that, but you're processing a lot, right? You are also trying to pay attention, which is really great. And right now, most of you look like really good kids, I gotta tell you. You're looking really great. But cognitive regulation is a pressure, right? Again, some of us are quite good at it, right? But all of you are being held up right now by the bottom in order to do what I need you to do, which is pay attention, process language, withhold your impulses, organize the information I'm giving you, right? Cognitive regulation is all those executive functioning skills that are so incredibly important for, say, success in school. But cognitive regulation, social regulation, and pro-social regulation are higher order brain functions. They live in this beautiful lid, the cortex, that we grow last. And most trauma, if it's going to be impactful, does not happen when we're 20. It starts when we're 2, right? And the brain we are building then is here, right? It's that lower brain. It's that almost reptilian brain in some places, and it's on the bottom of the pyramid. And so if our cognitive regulation is struggling, we can call someone ADHD. We can say, well, you can't pay attention. Or we can go a little lower and say, how's the bottom of the brain doing? So let's look at the bottom of the brain. Emotional regulation. Can you name it to tame it? Do you know how you feel, right? We are going to talk about a feeling today that probably no one's thought about much. I'm going to save that for a bit. Most of us think we're pretty good at this, right? The problem is everybody who experiences trauma gets called angry. So always, right? Every time we see a trauma-based reaction, and I'm going to show it, well, not every time. I'm going to say 80% of the time. It's like this, right? It's in your face, whether they're little kicking you in the shins or whether they're big telling you to fuck off. I know you've heard it. I don't have to worry about it, right? And in every case, we might say, why are you angry, right? And there's an interesting thing about that. I'm going to walk you through an example. I want you to imagine that I am walking with my 3-year-old child in the mall. She's now 12. She can do it on her own. But when she was 3, I want you to imagine. And I want you to imagine that I turn and my 3-year-old child is gone, right? Oh, I heard it right here. Oh, it's happened. Now, if my big brain managed that, if the top of my pyramid could do it, my cognitive regulation would be like, okay, Kristen, let's walk through this. She loves sparkly shoes. We walked past a shoe department. Let's go. We're over here. There she is. You're amazing. I love you. Let's go shopping. I love you. Right? Love that kid. Right? Yeah, that doesn't happen because the stress of going, I've lost my kid, flips my lid. And that top of the pyramid just falls off. And I'm just walking around doing this. Right? Where's my kid? Where's my kid? Where's my kid? And then I see my kid in the sparkly shoe department. And what do? Now I'm going to give you 2 choices. I do this. I go, oh my gosh, I love you. I'm so sorry. That was all on mommy. I should have been holding your hand tighter. I love you. I love you. I love you. Let's go shopping. Anybody ever see anybody lose their kid in the mall and then find them? Do you know? That's exactly right. I go, don't you ever leave me again. And if I'm really flipped, right, I do this. Now, how many of you wake up in the morning and say, I will never spank my child, right? And how many of you have lost your kid in the mall or seen your kid run across from the road and almost get hit by a car and you feel like spanking them, right? The question is, how do I look? If you were over here saying, what's wrong with Kristen? One, I look like a bad parent, right? And two, what emotion am I feeling? What emotion am I showing? I am angry. What emotion am I feeling? 150%. Every single time, right? But if someone just looks at me and says, what's wrong? They're going to say, why are you so mad? Do you know how many traumatized men are in anger management programs? Now, if you do anger management, because one time I actually walked into that, and there was a whole group of people that ran anger management programs in my program, or in my audience. And I was like, don't call it anger, right? They're having an emotion, they're having an experience, they're having a brain event that is making them look really wonky, right? What they look like is so meaningless. What they are experiencing is so important. Because let's keep going in the mall, right? So I take my kid, don't you ever leave me again, and then I drag her. We don't shop. She's not ever getting anything again her entire life. And I drag her out, right? And the reason she's 3 is because I want to put her in a car seat. Because when I put her in the car seat, I'm yanking it, right? And she's like, Mama, too tight. And my brain is like, do you realize that's trying to talk to the higher order brain? We're not paying attention right now. We're just trying to survive. We're all worked up. This is a wave. Mommy's got to ride. And then I pick up my phone. Now, how many of you know that it's not a very good kid move to use your phone when you're in the car, right? We all do, right? How many of you think I give a shit in that moment? I don't, right? I'm picking up my phone and I'm going to phone somebody that I think gets it. Now, if someone says, Kristen, why weren't you watching your kid? That's a pro-social regulation question. And you all went, oh, why would someone ask that, right? But how many times has somebody shown something and we've said, why would you do that? Right? Because we're frustrated, because we're overwhelmed, because we don't understand. Now, I'm a bit of a fighter in the old fight, flight, freeze system, and if I phone somebody and they say, Kristen, why weren't you watching your kid? I'm going to drive over to that person's house, and I'm going to use that phone for something different, right? If I had woken up in the morning and said, would I beat up my friend that I called today? The answer would have been like, what on earth planet would that ever happen? And then all of a sudden, fear takes over my brain and I'm acting wonky, right? Can we name it to tame it? I don't know. Are we getting curious enough about what we're actually feeling? And then holding up the whole bottom of this, right? Arousal regulation. This is where trauma goes, right? There's a bunch of things living in here. Your stress response system. Stress is not an emotion. Stress is a reaction, right? Stress is just hormones and chemicals. Chemicals, if they linger too long, start to impact the way our brain grows, right? The other thing in here, things like hunger and pain. How many of you are in pain? And at some point, which is why, because I wanted her to like me, no, I actually wanted her to be able to listen, which is why I asked her if she needed a footstool. Because if her pain gets too much, she's not going to be able to pay attention anymore, right? The bottom holds up the top. Our sensory system is in here, right? What is our sensory system? Well, our sight, sound, taste, feel, what things feel like, and smell. But we have 2 more, right? We have 2 more senses. We actually have 32, but I don't know half of them, and I'm only here for 2 hours. But we have 7 that I know of for sure. And my ECEs know these implicitly. They know exactly what I'm about to say. Because we have something, our 6th one is something called proprioception. It lives in our muscles and our joints and is acted upon when we do anything that pushes against our joints. But if we close our eyes and try and touch our fingers, try it for me. I apologize to the neighbors. Some people are going to suck at this, and you're going to get hit. So, well done. So folks that did it well, give yourself a pat in the back. Not because you had a skill, but because it really isn't a skill, but because you probably had a good sleep and you're not drunk. So that's 2 late. Well done. That's really all that means. That's all that means. Folks that sucked, yeah, I'm going to assume you're tired, right? And if you're drunk, come see me, because you're coping with something. Why we do this? This is a system that when we close our eyes, tells us where we are in space, right? Why we talk about it in a pyramid on regulation is because think about when you're distressed, or critically, think about when a baby's distressed, right? 4-month-old baby on the ground? Am I going to come up to that baby and say, hey, baby, I don't know what the hell your problem is, but if you could just wrap this up so the rest of the class could listen, that would be awesome. Otherwise, get out, right? Baby, screaming. What if I went up to the baby over here and said, hey, baby, I can tell you're stressed out. Just try and let go of those thoughts. Just feel the ground. Is it hard? Is it cold? Beautiful, right? Some mindfulness, maybe a little yoga. Amazing. But what do we know about that 4-month-old baby? They have no skills in this regard, right? They have one. Their regulatory skill is this. Ah! That's it. That's all they have, if they have learned it. And I will tell you, I have met some 4-month-old babies that learn not to cry because no one ever comes, right? And then when we go to pick them up, they do this. And we either say, this baby doesn't want me, or we say, how do I teach this baby that I am safe? It's got to be number 2, right? But I don't need my ECEs to answer the next question. What am I going to do to that baby? What am I going to do to calm that baby? I'm going to pick it up. Thank you very much. I was like, uh-oh, no one knows the answer. I'm going to pick it up. Now, am I going to pick it up like this and just be like, baby, stop crying. Come on, what's your problem? I'm going to do one thing and one thing only, right? I'm going to do this. And I want you to ask yourself, what book did you read that in? What course did you take to help you understand that, right? You didn't. This is very intuitive if we just let all the stuff that's telling us we're doing it wrong get out of our heads. If we go to what we believe someone needs from a caring perspective, we pick them up and we do this. We are using proprioception. We're using a little bit of smell. And if it doesn't work, we kick in sense number 7, which is our vestibular system, which does this, or this, right? Or hangs upside down, right? Fascinatingly, the only system we lose if we don't use, which is why you can rock it on the behemoth when you're 15, and you barf up your funnel cake when you're 51, right? That's all that's going on there. But we all know, how many of you have raised your own kids or babysat, and you've gone and said, this worked for number 1, but this is what number 2 needed, right? And how many of you at some point wanted to drop that baby while you were trying to figure that out, right? Be honest. My number 1 that would wake up and cry for an hour every night at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I lived on a 2nd floor. What I'm about to say is going to sound a little sociopathic, but when I was walking with that baby once, my brain did say, if you drop this baby, you'd probably stop crying. Now, I did not drop my baby, right? But I didn't drop my baby because I had the resources within myself to put my baby down in the crib. But if someone did shake their baby, right, what do we make an assessment about them? What an awful human being. No, what an exhausted, overwhelmed, stressed out, no skills, no mentoring, no one to show, and a brain that gets so triggered by that sound, right? It's hard figuring out what that baby needs. But how many of you realized that after you figured it out, it got kind of easier? That's what this is about. We're going to take that idea of once we start to figure it out, once we stick around long enough, it actually is going to start to get easier, recognizing that figuring out might take us some time, then we are going to find that we can do this pyramid pretty well. Arousal regulation, it's huge. Sensory, sleep, right? Oh, did I mention sleep? Sleep's in there. Stress, hunger, pain, wellness. If that is struggling, it's hard to do the top. How many of you had an example of being in a meeting and then seeing a call from your kid's school, and you pick up the call and they said, your kid's fallen off the gym equipment? And how many of you go, I no longer am paying attention to what Jamie's saying, right? Are you a bad kid that can't pay attention? No. Has the bottom taken over its ability to support the top? Yes. So I'm going to walk through an example of this, okay? We do this all the time. I do this all the time, right? I am no different than the folks that have experienced trauma. My brain is just better resourced, right? I've had more relationships to help me, and I've had more opportunities for learning to figure out how to move past it. But when the pyramid crumbles, we all kind of look the same. So I want you, as I talk about this story, to think about the pressures that the top of the pyramid can put on the bottom, and how critically important it is to have a strong bottom. So this is a story, it's an oldie, but I hope a goodie, from when Game of Thrones was in like season 6. Because otherwise, if it was like season 8, does anybody remember how bad the last season was? I'd be much unhappier telling this story. But this is like classic, fantastic Game of Thrones time. It was something that my husband and I would do together at night after we got all the kids to bed. And my kids were much younger. They're all teenagers now, but they were much younger then. And so, you know, I had a busy day. Like when I think about my pyramid, pro-social regulation, normally I'm a pretty good kid. If I think about things like, did I get to all my emails? Did I get to all my paperwork? Would my college think I was a good kid? Yeah, it's a bit of a pressure, right? We always feel it. And the funny thing about human beings is we rarely walk away from our day going, this is what I knocked out of the park. We walk away from our day going, this is what I forgot to do, right? And it just adds that pressure on the top. Social regulation, as I mentioned, is a strength for me. I don't like everybody I meet, I'll be really honest, right? And even within my caseload, I will see some days where I'll go, ooh, that person's going to take more energy from me. Not because I don't necessarily like them, right? But because they challenge me in a way that drains me a little bit more. And so I had one of those that day, right? This is a true story. I had one of those that day. And so put some pressure on the pyramid. Cognitive regulation, right now I do a lot of talking, but to be honest, most of the time I do a lot of listening, right? I love doing trainings because it's my chance to talk, maybe. That's maybe why I like doing them. But most of the time I'm listening. And when you work with folks that have experienced trauma, if I get distracted, they read it as rejection. And so it's really important that I'm incredibly mindful and present in the room. And I work really hard to be that person, but it's exhausting. And then I come home from work and I'm carrying not just the emotions of the folks that I support, but the emotions of my kiddos, whatever I've been feeling from the day. And then I finally get all the kids to bed and this kind of stuff, and I sit beside my husband, and my arousal regulation system at the end of the day goes, oh, we made it. Now, interestingly, we all have strategies when our arousal regulation system is feeling some pressure, right? If we're asking a lot at the top, our arousal regulation system starts to go, it's getting kind of heavy down here, and it starts to do some strategies. Anybody notice mine? What do? To hold up my top, to be a good kid, and to pay attention to everything I'm saying, which so far I don't think I've lost track of. What am I doing other than about to drink caffeine, which is a fake arousal regulation strategy? I'm podium phobic, okay? And I'm not podium phobic because I don't know how to stand still. I think better when I move. I am not ADHD, right? I like movement, right? How many of you have students that are just tapping the whole time because we expect kids to learn while they sit? And not all of us learn that way, right? If we can take information and then walk, how many of you have a big conversation and be like, I need to go for a walk, and then your brain just takes it all in, right? That's me. I'm that person, right? And so I walk around. How many of you are starting to feel like your caffeine is slipping? You got to pee a little bit. Feel free to get up. I'm not stopping for an hour and a bit, so if you need to pee, go. But how many of you, on those incredibly, I'm going to say hopefully comfortable chairs, how many of you are starting to engage in your own little strategies, right? How many of you are stretching a little bit? How many of you are moving? How many of you are twirling your hair? How many of you already realized that you've lost attention and then done something like stretched and went, oh God, I'm not paying attention anymore? And how many of you are doing my personal favorite, dripping with sarcasm? How many of you do this, the old rapid leg bounce, right? Oh, someone in the front row, she's crossed her legs and she's like, oh no, yeah. The rapid leg bouncer, it's fascinating, right? How many of you are sitting beside a rapid leg bouncer? Because they're irritating, they really are. But why is a rapid leg bouncer bouncing their leg? Are they bouncing their leg to be a dick? Probably not. Are they bouncing their leg? Are they bouncing their leg to irritate you and poor social regulation? No. You know why they're bouncing their leg? Because they don't like sitting on uncomfortable chairs and their cognitive regulation is really heavy right now and they are trying to be a good kid. That's why they're bouncing their leg. It's fascinating, right? I'm married to one of those. And on this particular day, oh yeah, on this particular day, when I sat down on the couch to watch Game of Thrones, I was pretty tired, right? I'd had a really long day, and I had a bad day. Some stuff had happened, big emotions, and I was just spent. And I sat down with A glass of wine, I apologize, I still use that every once in a while. I know I shouldn't. I think millennials and Gen Ys, or whatever you are, hate me for it. But I'm a Gen Xer, and I really, really like my glass of wine at the end of a day. And that's a little arousal regulation strategy for me, right? Sort of calms me down. I don't use it all the time. I like TV as much, right, at the end of the long day. And I sat down with that, TV, wine, husband. And it's a nice combo. It is. It's a nice combo most of the time. On this day, not so much, because I queued up Game of Thrones and started it, and then the rapid leg bouncing started, and the whole couch started to move. And normally I can manage this, but my arousal regulation system had taken all it could, right? And it's like, what is happening here? Now, I tried some passive-aggressive strategies, right? I paused. I glared. I rewound. Right? Nothing. He's just like, didn't get it at all, right? He's probably like, why does she keep rewinding? Doesn't communicate that with me, of course. Just keeps bouncing his leg. Now, again, remember, I know why he's bouncing his leg, right? My knowledge of that in this moment doesn't matter. But I did think, I need this to stop. And so I then thought, oh, this is my husband. And so I clamped down, did a little, like, kind of potentially, maybe something could happen. Nothing was going to. I'm exhausted. We have 3 kids. Like, come on, right? And but that was kind of, and that did it. I just kept my hand on his leg. And if we had stopped there, I would have enjoyed Game of Thrones. Gord opened a bag of nachos and shit hit the fan. That's all I can tell you happened. Because what I heard in that moment was this. And this is fascinating, right? How many of you, when you're tired, exhausted, overwhelmed, can't stand sounds around you, right? And I look over at this human being, and all sorts of stuff was happening in my pyramid. I'm irritated, right? I'm a little bit angry. I'm thinking really unpleasant thoughts about this human being, right? Like, that's the mouth that I had kids with, right? Now, biology, that's actually not how it works. Like, we gotta... Don't worry if you're like, oh, shit, if I kiss somebody, I'll have a baby. No, it's got to go further. But at some points, I've actually liked this human being. And in this moment, I looked at him, I was disgusted, I was overwhelmed, and then I attacked him. Because my pyramid completely crumbled. And I turned to him and went, what's wrong? That's what I said. Now, how many of you think that's okay? None of you should, right? You're not going to read a single book on marriage that says when your husband's had a long day and is bouncing his leg, try and yell at him as loud as you possibly can. But when my pyramid crumbles, I don't have a lot of strategies, right? When my pyramid crumbles and this part of my brain is like, we're done here, I am either going to go hide in my garage and start building something, or I am going to yell at the person that I love, right? Maybe I'm going to beat myself up if I don't have that option, right? And I turn to him and I say, what is your problem? Now, if Gord met me where I was at, and I want you to think about this, because so often we meet fire with fire, right? If Gord met me and went, what is my problem? What is your problem? I would have been over here and started thinking about all the bad things he's ever done to me his entire life. That's what would have happened. I would have dug in my heels and been like, remember 4 years ago when you did this? And remember 10 years ago when you did this? And it's true. I see it all the time. I would have told him everything, and then he would have been yelling back at me. And then we would have had to go to marital therapy, and then the marital therapist would have been, go for dinner. And then we'd go for dinner, and the chomping mouth is there again, and the bouncing leg. And then we're divorced, and someone says, what happens? And I'm like, I think he ate nachos during Game of Thrones. It's weird. On that particular day, he's going to sound like a rock star in this moment, but I'm not, and a lot of the times he is, but he's not always perfect. In that moment, he did this. What does that mean? That means I have no clue what's going on here, but I know it's going to make it worse. So I'm just going to take a really deep breath. And then he asked me one question. He said, bad day, Kristen? Now that's 25 years of marriage, right? Well, wasn't quite that then. But that is someone that took a step back and went, this isn't her, right? Well, sometimes it is, right? But I need to understand that when she's at her worst, she probably needs me the most. And that's a safe relationship. We are lucky if we have them, right? We are so lucky if we have those relationships that say, I don't have to like what you're doing. and we are going to talk about how to shift things in the future, but in this moment, you're the screaming baby, right? And if I yell at you, I make it worse. If I judge you, I make it worse. If I expect more from you in that moment, I make it worse, right? But if I understand that something is going on to make you look wonky, then we're going to start walking in the right direction. Interestingly, I didn't want to talk about it that day. I said to Gord, yeah, bad day. And he's like, want to talk about it? And I was like, no. He's like, okay. What was fascinating is he went on and continued to eat nachos and probably bounced his leg, and I didn't care anymore. I was able to pay attention because the gas at the tank I got from that understanding is more powerful than anything else. It also allowed me the next day to go, I don't want to yell at Gord for nachos anymore, right? And then I take a step back and go, what do I need to do differently? And if I didn't know the answer to that, I'd ask somebody. But I knew what I needed to do, right? And it wasn't that I needed to be better. I needed to look after myself more. You know, in my day of craziness, right, I don't do anything for myself on those days most of the time. And in the end, I end up yelling at someone I love because of nachos. That's the pyramid. We've all done it. You laugh in that story because you've all been there, right? I once had someone come up to me and said, you've just solved a mystery for me. And he was like, 10 years ago, I was at a party with my then fiance. He goes, I got really drunk and I left and I didn't tell her. And when I came back, she slapped me in the face. And he's like, it was so weird. And he's like, she was that. And I was like, she was that. She was terrified and overwhelmed and didn't know where you were. And when you came back, she slapped you. Is it okay she slapped you? No, that's aggression. That's not good. But if we want to understand how to make that not happen again, maybe next time he could tell his wife he needs to go walk off a bit of a drink, right? And in my case, I can look after myself so I don't run out of steam. Now I do this. The other day, it's been a rough September for a lot of reasons, work-wise. And the other day, my son was sitting beside me and he chews his nails. It's his arousal regulation strategy. And he only does it when he's tired or trying to be a good kid, right? Waiting in line or something like that. And he's chewing on his nails, and I felt that irritation. And rather than yell at him, I was like, kiddo, I love you, but I'm out. I'm going somewhere else. I'm going to go to bed because I actually don't think I can enjoy the movie and navigate these sounds today, right? And that's the difference, and that's understanding the pyramid. So when we start thinking about what trauma does, I want you to think about the fact that trauma impacts the bottom. It challenges our sense that we have safe relationships, even if we are safe, right? There was research that was done with 2-year-olds. 2-year-olds, a group of 2-year-olds that were good enough raised. We don't have to be perfect to raise great kids. In fact, if we screw up and fix it and try to understand the challenges, we actually raise stronger brains than if we are perfect. So if you're like a snowplow, wraparound, bubble wrap parent, remember that, right? It's like putting out a houseplant in the winter. We want to make sure we prep it. And so a little stress is good, right? But when we have too much stress, it overwhelms our ability to access adults. So in this research, a group of kids that were good enough raised, these were 2-year-olds, and a group of 2-year-olds that had come into care because of neglect, right? This was old study. Now probably they would still be with their family. There's much more resources to wrap around and keep kids at home, but these kids had come into care. And what they looked at was to see what the kids did when somebody else became distressed. Now, distress is a funny thing. If I start to cry right now, you're going to get a little uncomfortable. That's biology. You can't do anything about that, right? That is a part of the brain that does not have thinking. It just reacts. Now, hopefully, the part of your brain that does have thinking goes, I wonder if Kristen's okay, I'll go ask her, and doesn't rush me and tackle me to the floor, right? But the biology you can't do anything about. It's cortisol. And what was interesting is both groups had that same biological reaction, right? It's biology. In both cases, in the face of somebody else's distress, these little 2-year-olds, stress went up, right? The 2-year-olds that were good enough raised looked like pretty great kids, right? They walked up, they got curious, they sort of did this. And then every single one of them, 100% of them, at some point did this, which is the universal sign of, hey, taller person, right? I've done everything I can do here. I have very limited skills in this regard, but I know you can manage it, right? 100% of kids. Kids that had experienced neglect, right? And this is pretty significant neglect to be in care. The kids had that same biological response. 90% of them became physically aggressive towards the person who was distressed, right? 10% of them laughed. How many of you have watched an offender smile or smirk, and the paper's like, offender smiled as they were reading the theft. It's like, yeah, the likelihood of that being a sociopath, again, is slim. The likelihood of that person having all sorts of emotions they don't understand, can't imagine, get dysregulated by, so they smile, is what most of us do. One time my kid, now 16, not a very coordinated child, was, when he was 5, chasing his much more athletic cousin down a hill, and I was at the bottom. And you know when you're watching your kid and you're thinking, uh-oh, this is a train wreck about to happen. And that was me. I was at the bottom watching my son run down a hill, lose control, and start to fall. And just tumble, right? My sister was beside me and she said, oh my God, Kristen, you're smiling. Like I was some sort of sociopath. And I was like, oh yeah, I'm actually not finding this funny, but I'm distressed and I can do nothing about it, right? And so I smiled. And not because I wanted to, because that is the way my system just responded. Just like the 2-year-olds. 90% physically aggressive, I've yelled at my husband, 10% smiled. None of them did something very important though, right? Not one of them looked up. Imagine being 2 years old and saying, I don't know what this feeling is, it stresses me out, but no one in the world can help me. And if they have not learned that, what a safe relationship is, they bring that into your space and they test it, right? All the time. We're going to talk about that more. And so trauma starts to narrow that bottom because there's no safe relationships, or they don't know how to access them, or they stress them out, or they push them away, or they kick them in the shins, right? And then the arousal regulation system is impacted because that's where trauma goes. Trauma goes to stress. Trauma alters the way we manage our senses, right? Trauma makes it hard to manage the top because the bottom is so struggling, right? And so we have to understand that when we see the pyramid crumble, right, it's likely because stress has gotten high. The question is where? And that's how we can begin to start to understand how to intervene. So this is the window of tolerance. This is arousal regulation. I'm going to talk about window of tolerance. That's what the arousal regulation system is. The window is, how long can I last before I'm yelling at my husband for nachos? That's basically what that means. Inside is stress. Now, it might be the stress of, oops, I hit a button. It might be the stress of my caffeine is slipping. It might be the stress of I need to pee. Hopefully, most of you have strategies. Someone just walked away from me, like on cue. She's like, yeah, I do need to pee. And the reason that was important is because that peeing, right, is going to allow her to come back and pay more attention, right? Because if you start to notice this, your window starts to say, I'm a little shaky here, right? If we are in our window, we are learning. If we are in our window, we can act like a good kid. If we are in our window, we can learn new skills to manage our friendships, right? If we are not in our window, we can't. We cannot learn if we are not here. And so I was once doing work up in Nineveh in the school system, like they brought me in, I didn't live up there. And I was asked, how much should we spend time on making sure someone's in their window versus teaching curriculum? And it's like, well, if people aren't in their window, they're not learning the curriculum you're saying anyways, right? And so you answer that question. How can you tell someone's in their window? How do you help them get back in their window? And how do you use your understanding in that moment to help them learn the stuff you're teaching, right? This is trauma, okay? So trauma narrows the window of tolerance because we don't have a lot of strategies, because we haven't had those safe relationships, because the stress has overwhelmed the system. And then it has this impaired stress response, right? I tend to crumble only at the end of long days. I don't normally have big amygdala responses. Folks with trauma do, right? I once had a teacher tell me that their 16-year-old student, she went up and said, hey, you don't have a pencil, right? Where's your pencil? I think she said, where's your pencil? And he said, fuck you, bitch, and slammed his desk or flipped his desk and stormed out. Now that's a flight response. It's really important. Flight is aggressive, right? If you have someone saying mean things, that is likely not fight. Fight is this, bring it on. Flight is, I'm going to buy time so I can get out of here, and I'm going to buy time by telling you something horrible about yourself. Most of the time that's flight, right? You're a bitch, I'm out, right? My husband, you're the worst wife ever, and then he leaves. That's my husband, right? He's a flighter, and we've worked through that. But that was a flight response. Now this teacher understood that. That's a really impaired amygdala response. There's no reason to feel scared in that moment. But that teacher approaching and that teacher asking that question flipped that kid's lid. She let him go, which is very smart on her part, because if you stop a flighter, it's bad, right? Cats in cages, they scratch you because they're meant to run. So do humans. And so she waited for her class to get settled. She went and found him. He was pacing and smoking by doors he's not supposed to smoke by. I don't think he cared about the rule all that much at that time. And at one point he looked over and she said, "You okay?" And he said, "No." And she said, "You want to talk about it?" He said, "No." I said, "You sure?" And then he turned to her and he said, "I slept in my car last night. My parents are fighting again. I don't have a fucking pencil." And she said, "I get it. Do you want help?" "No." "Okay, take your time, all the time you need. I hope you come back to class. I've got lots of pencils." He did. He showed back up, right? Why? Because she added nothing else to the pyramid other than, "I get you, buddy," and come back. Now, is that okay? No, it's not great that he told her to fuck off. And the next day she might want to say, "So how are we going to manage this stress response in my class? Because that wasn't super okay yesterday," right? But in the moment she calmed the cat came back into the classroom. She put a pencil on his desk, and he learned that day. Probably not tons, but he learned the teacher was trying. This is the impaired stress response. We don't have a ticker that says, "My window of tolerance is narrow. I've had a lot of bad things happen, and I might yell at you at some point if you're not really, really safe." We just have behaviors. So look at the behaviors, right? How many of you seen these? Emotionally reactive, impulsive, hypervigilant, watching for whether you're safe. Hyperdefensive, wasn't me, it was them, right? Couldn't have been me. I've had kids pee in bottles, leave them on their sink, and say it was their dad. And I'm like, really? That's probably not your dad doing that. Rejection sensitivity, that's waiting to be a failure and anticipating that. Difficulty sleeping, nightmares, hyperactivity, restlessness, explosive aggressive behavior. And down below, when we've just got nothing left, right? We're shut down, emotionless, tuned out. I don't want to be here anyway. This is our resistant, defiant folks, right? All of those are behaviors related to how well this person can regulate. And if you're seeing those behaviors, the answer is, at least in this moment, not great. So can't the baby, right? There is no difference. Just a bigger package with more words. Any questions on that? Yes?
Can you go to the line?
Yep. Oh, yes, such a good point, and normally something I mentioned and forgot. So in the impaired stress response, so most of us, if we have a big reaction, like let's imagine you almost get in a car accident, right? Most of us have the strategies to get back in our window. So that would be a flying up, but then we'd say, take deep breaths, calm down, call a friend, and we'd get back in our window. What happens in trauma, because the window is narrow and because the stress response is intense, and often because there's a caregiver reaction that feeds it, the reaction is very high, but they don't have the strategies to get back in the window without us. And so they come down below. So let's say a kid, I'm going to walk through an example so you understand why it goes doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. That's the professional term for that. Let's say a kid tells you to fuck off and he gets suspended, right? So the idea of suspension, maybe, well, I think the idea of suspension is actually to teach the big brain that they don't want to act that way again and to learn from the consequence. Can I just tell you, an ACE score of 3, you're 32 times more likely to get suspended. 32 times. Which means if you get suspended once and you're an ACE score of 1, you probably don't do the behavior that got you suspended again. You're in adult education. Your kids have been suspended a lot, right, before they showed up on your door, or they just dropped out. ACE score of 4, you're the ones dropping out of school, right? And so let's imagine for this, the suspension is to calm down, right? And so we say, go home, calm down. But that kid has this big reaction, but then comes in, but doesn't know how to calm down, doesn't know how to get safe, doesn't know how to support themselves. Maybe they go home and cut a little bit, right? That's an arousal regulation strategy. Maybe they go, very likely, go and smoke pot. That's an arousal regulation strategy. But it doesn't help them get safely in their window. And so they come back to school the next day below it. And how do they come back to school? Do they come back to school like this? I'm so excited to be at school. No, they come back to school going, I hate all you fuckers. I don't want to be here anyway. What's the big deal, right? And they sit in your class. Ooh, I hope I didn't screw that up. They sit in your class like this, waiting, watching for you to come up and say, hey, bud, what's your problem? And then they're going to do the whole thing over again. Does that make sense? Impaired amygdala, hard to get back in. Where we've got a ride, they don't have the strategies to get there. Yeah?
How do you I can almost see kids thinking, when you tell that pencil story, I'm thinking that kid was thinking, if she asked me about my pencil, I'm going to blow, and then he did. And
Yeah.
So I can see it coming, but how do you stop it? Like, how do you?
Yeah.
Do you ignore it? Do you talk to them quietly later? Like, I try to think how I would deal with that.
So I love number 2, right? So the challenge with ignoring, we have to learn to ignore some stuff, right? Like some of the arousal regulation stuff, you're going to have to learn to ignore because it's going to get under your skin and they're needing it. But in that situation, this idea that I'm ready to blow, it is not because of the question about the pencil.
No,
It's
they're giving themselves permission to blow, right?
yeah, but probably because they're sitting in class going, I'm a stupid idiot. We're about to come up to a pitfall that I'm going to talk about really soon, but that's likely what's happening, and so they're just waiting to get out, right? And so if you talk to them about it after, right? So let's say you go up and say, hey, bud, do you need a pencil? And you get the reaction. Once the lid is flipped, let the reaction happen. Like, it's really important we just support the reaction coming, and when they're ready for co-regulation, and I am going to talk about this in the next hour of conversation more, but we support when we can and when folks are ready to let us support, right? But the critical next step is, hey, bud, let's talk about what's going on, right? Because if we focus on the pencil, right, you've got pretty worked up, you didn't have a pencil, we are missing the point, and I'm about to get there. I want to be able to go, what's going on in class? Because you don't feel very safe coming in here, right? And how do we make this different? Critically, if that kid got suspended for that, now you were in open detention, they have nowhere to go. Well, open detention, I suppose. But the critically is that the next day, you go out of your way to make sure that kid gets that you like them still, right? And so it's that's 3 approaches. We let the reaction happen. We try and build up our grounding strategies, our ability to calm ourselves. I'm going to talk about that to shorten the reaction time, right? We then try and process and help to understand what was going on that led to that reaction in the first place. And then we really focus on creating the safety in order for those to minimize the reactions happening again. Okay? That's a very short answer. Ask me again if I haven't answered it at the end of the day. Okay? No, don't apologize for that at all, because what I was just about to say, I love where your brain is going, right? Because the brain is going, that kid's coming in wanting to escape. And that's a really important thing to understand. It's also important to understand that bravery is what got that kid into your classroom in the first place, right? That's really important to understand. I once had a teacher say to me, the kid does nothing. I've tried everything, the kid does nothing. And I said, how about asking him what it is about him that brings him into the classroom in the first place? Because, man, that's brave, right? Your kid's brave, but they're sitting there going, when are they going to figure out that I'm an idiot? We're going to get there. Any other questions? Love the way the brains are going here. So what impacts our windows? Well, stress, right, for sure. Adversity, trauma, poor sleep. That's a lot of mine, right? Illness, not exercising, not eating enough, isolation, not engaging with folks, insecure relationships, right? Lack of safety on the bottom. This is attachment. Do I feel like I can wander out, explore my world, and if I fall and trip, phone somebody and they'll still like me? Maladaptive coping, that's cutting, that's drug use, that's isolating yourself from folks. Sometimes when we see in relationships, when people's pyramids are struggling, they start maladaptive coping by sort of freezing each other out, right? And then that impacts the relationship. Pressures. The pyramid is a pressure system, right? Pro-social. How many times have you been told to act like a good kid and you're not, right? How many times have you been told that no one's going to like you if you keep acting this way? Pressure. Social pressures. Can you navigate those friendships? Learning pressures. If you've had trauma, you're going to have difficulty processing language in the same way, right? That's not your fault. None of that's your fault. We just have to get curious about how to support you in learning language in a different way. Emotions, I'm going to come to them because we're missing one. And then at the bottom, safety, right? How do we have it? And then critically, other people's windows. Can you stay in yours? Co-regulation is fascinating. People think of co-regulation as like, I'm going to help you. And that is what it should be, right? But co-regulation goes both ways. So if I have a screaming baby and I pick it up and I scream at it, I'm co-regulating that baby in the wrong direction. But that is technically co-regulation. Co-regulation is using where I am at to try and influence the regulation of somebody else. Ideally, to a better place, right? We can also co-regulate, whereas if this person right here, what's your name?
Sherry.
Sherry. If Sherry told me a really excited story and I went like this, I'm not co-regulating very well, right? She's going to be like, oh, Kristen doesn't like me very much. But if she tells me an exciting story, I'm like, oh my God, Sherry, that was so fantastic. We're co-regulating, we like each other. And Sherry's going to leave going, I like Kristen, right? Even though I've done nothing but just share her space, right? I think it's a big deal. And that's what co-regulation is. And so when we think about what makes things helpful for someone, we have to start with, what role am I playing, right? What am I bringing to the party? We don't like to look at that very often, and it is the most important thing that we can do. So let's start talking about this. Let's start talking about how we build these windows in these folks, whether they are 4 or whether they are 44. It's all kind of the same, slightly different techniques. Theory is the same, right? We're going to do it by understanding that regulation, and we're going to do it through relationship. And for that, we need something called attunement. Now, as I said, I spent a lot of time learning how to diagnose. I use 2 things now, 3 things. I use the pyramid all the time, and I use volcanoes and icebergs. So what is a volcano? Well, a volcano tells me that once the lava is being seen, whatever has happened has already happened. So what is lava? Any examples? What do you think lava is? Aggression is 100% lava, right? Telling you off, that's lava, right? Lava is also other interesting things. Saying thank you is lava, right? Lava doesn't have to be bad, right? What about showing up to class? That's lava, right? Being a good kid, that's lava, to be honest. Not showing up to class is lava. Yelling at someone is lava. Swearing at somebody. Bouncing my legs is lava. Everything I can see and witness for good, for bad, or for otherwise. Oh, I didn't realize there was a door there. Magic. Anything we can see is lava. What is important is the volcano. So the question over here, open custody, what's your name? Paul. So Paul's question over here, he started to think about the volcano, which is, I think this kid just wants to get out of here, right? And so the flipping the desk was lava. The question is, what's going on that makes him want to leave, right? And when we start thinking about the volcano, we start understanding what kids could need. Why does that kid want to leave? Maybe learning's been really, really hard, right? Maybe he doesn't feel safe anywhere he is. Maybe he thinks he's an idiot. I'm going to come to that one. I think it's a big one. But what he shows us in and of itself is meaningless. And so when we start thinking about lava, I want you to think about how often that's what you're reacting to, right? Because so often that's what we are. Gord's saying to me, what's your problem? That's reacting to lava. But if we react to lava all the time, we spin our wheels. Now, folks think I don't like rewards and consequences. I don't like consequences. I don't like speeding tickets. It's why I have Waze that tell me when the cop is there, which is really bad. And I'm like, slow down. Waze just said there's a cop. I don't like consequences. I do like rewards. I am not doing this for free, right? Would I? Maybe I like Andrea. But I'd still probably like a cookie or something like that, right? Why do we like rewards? Because we like them, right? Why don't I always like talking about rewards? Because rewards are based on lava, right? Rewards are like, if you can show me you're a good kid, you get a reward. But if we don't understand whether the volcano can do it, those kids will fail, right? All the time. And then we get frustrated, and we start spinning our wheels in lava. So I want you to start thinking, what happens when lava occurs? What do I do? Well, let's talk about the big lava, right? When big lava happens, what do? Do you validate the feelings, even if it's just in your head? I think this person's feeling overwhelmed. I think Kristen was scared when she lost her kid in the mall. Before I intervene, even if the feelings do not appear rational, I'm going to come to that very soon. Do we listen to what the student is saying? Do we provide choices in the moment? Not if then, but choices. I see you're struggling. You can either stay and try and take a couple deep breaths, or you can walk out, right, and take a couple deep breaths and come back when you're ready. Do we use encouraging statements? Do we use positive reinforcement when the lava is starting to say, I don't like myself very much, or I'm too stupid, or I can't do this? Do we start to provide a space for that student to calm down? Most students flight. Where are they going? That's a great question to ask the student the next day who took off with the pencil. Listen, if you feel like that, do you want to go and hang out in the student room and I can come check on you after, right? Do you avoid arguing with the student? Right? Because that's going to co-regulate in a different direction. Do you minimize public confrontation? Why would you want to do that? Embarrassment is a really big feeling, right? Really big feeling. And do you avoid threatening punishment in the moment? Because you should, because that would be like me paying attention to my daughter saying, this is too tight, and I wasn't, right? So when we start thinking about what do I do when lava happens, I want you to say, the first thing I'm going to do is take a step back and go, am I okay? Remember, stress is biologically contagious. And the second thing I'm going to do is going, what do I think's happening? Not what I think is wrong. And that's the shift. The iceberg is a little different. Woo! Very, very excited. The iceberg reminds me that what I see is very, very, very unimportant when we consider everything together. Underneath, what's happened, not what's wrong. It's very easy to say what's wrong. You're mad. That's what's wrong. You're a bad parent. That's what's wrong. You're an unmotivated, lazy student. That's what's wrong. Nope. What's happened? In the moment, right? The night before when the parents are fighting and he slept in his car. What's happened in their journey to school to get here? What happened at breakfast and did they eat, right? And what could be going on that I need to get curious about? What's the stress? Put glasses on and start to go, I wonder if this kid can sit in a room for 2 hours and not know how to ask to go because doesn't feel confident that if he walks out and goes to the bathroom that I won't make fun of him, right? Or them. What are the strengths? When we start to think about what a child or youth or adult does well, we lighten the load on the pyramid. So how do I get curious about bringing those strengths in all the time? And then finally, underneath this iceberg is what do they need? And they need someone sticking around long enough to be able to answer those questions. That's it, just like the baby, right? Do we win them all? No. I want to be really careful here that there's going to be some folks, especially with our adults, that aren't ready yet to trust that you are safe. But you never know the moment you're going to make a difference, right? You never know. My own research with kids in corrections, they were all in fairly significant custody situations. And when I talked to them about did they believe they could be something different, right? Did they believe that they could, enter into treatment and make change? To a person, the ones that believed they could, in a realistic way. I had some folks like, yeah, I'm going to be an NFL football player. It's like, no, you're in prison and you don't play football, so that might not happen. But the kids that were like, it's going to be hard, I don't know, but I'm going to try, they had one thing in common. Somebody in their journey believed they could be different. And overwhelmingly, now again, they're in prison, so we're not there yet, but overwhelmingly, that person was found in a school. Right? So you have no idea when you make a difference, but if you're adding fuel to the fire, you are not going to be that one. Any questions on that? We all still happy? Okay. Yes, Paul.
Sorry to ask you that.
Never apologize.
But what I'm thinking about is I want to provide a safe place.
Mm-hmm.
And they're out of my class in 7 weeks. We have 7-week class. And I don't want to be that person. I don't want to become a safe place and then have to say in 8 weeks, sorry, I don't have time right now because I won't have time. And that's what I've always been balancing, because to get to the iceberg, they have to open up to you. And I don't want to be the person that they open up to and say, sorry, you can come and talk to me for 5 minutes after school on one day when I don't have 30 students at my desk waiting for me.
Yeah. So, and I think that is an incredibly important question, and we hear this a lot, because lots of folks have folks for a short period of time, or lots of folks have folks, for example, in residential treatment or something where they only have it. So when people say to me, what do I do if I only know someone for 7 weeks, right? Or 8 weeks? I say your goal is this. Learn enough through your observation and your curiosity. It doesn't have to be deep, meaningful conversations, right? It can be. And again, being able to set a boundary with someone to say, bud, I'm always going to think about you and I'm always going to care about you, but I'm going to also help you learn that teacher Y can do too, right? It's this piece of, I never want folks to feel that building an attachment in a short period of time is damaging. It isn't. And the reason it isn't is because you are teaching them that someone cares, right? What you then do is say, I've learned that you do better in math if you have the first 2 questions. And then, whatever, right? You have the first 2 questions, and then you get to take a break. You okay if I tell your next teacher that these are some strategies that work for you, right? And what you do is you say, I am taking what I learn about you through the curiosity that I've had about small statements, right? And I'm going to tell next teacher. And in saying, I'm going to create a village for you, I might not always be the one in the village, but my job is to help you feel that the next teacher can and the next teacher can. I once had someone say, hold on for them for the moments that you can and help them learn that there are other people out there that can hold on too, right? And so I know I'm speaking metaphorically, Paul.
No, it's great.
Okay. But that, again, never underestimate, right? I have a kiddo that has just graduated from adult education, and I'm going to bring that up again a little bit, but talks about that second teacher I think she had. She's been out of school for a long time, but noticed how incredibly bright she is. She's very, very, very bright, but also noticed how incredibly anxious. And all she said to this girl was, you're actually I think you're insanely smart, but you get really anxious, so how do we problem solve some of this stuff? She came to me that day and was like, oh my gosh, a teacher gets me, right? One teacher that she had once, but that teacher told the administrator, and the administrator met with my student, and the administrator said, I hear you get anxious, but you're a rock star student, right? And every single teacher then got that message about that student, and it created a village of safety, right? And so use your relationship to build a village, right? Are they going to find you in 5 years, Paul? Yes. And what's fascinating is you may not remember them, right? My sister's a high school teacher. She's now retired. She had someone come to her a couple years ago say, you changed my life. And she's like, I felt badly because I had no idea who I was talking to. And that is someone she would have had for a class, right? And whatever she did in those moments, she doesn't even remember, but he did. Yeah.
I always think of it as planting seeds.
Planting seeds.
And they're going to grow away from me, but I've done that bit for them then.
Yeah.
And that's all I can say.
That's 100%. But planting seeds means that you see growth. And that is what's so incredibly important, right? This is attunement. We're getting it. I'm feeling it. I got little goosebumps, to be honest. I'm like, oh, this is all goosebumpy. And it's goosebumpy because it's that feeling of, these are folks in here that want to make a difference, right? And I got to tell you, ECE folks, whoo, you make a difference. But oh my goodness, giving people a second chance to rewrite their story is incredible, right? And whatever role you play with those folks, it's incredible. And so when we think about attunement, that's where we go. We go beneath the iceberg. We go into the volcano, and we say, what's going on for this person? And we validate that, right? We validate where they're at. We support them in problem solving. We start thinking about ways that we can understand their triggers and get curious about what's going to make it difficult for them to be safe. We can use our connection to then facilitate direction, how to learn, how to support, how to act like a good kid, right? And it's really important that it is felt when it is there, and it builds that pyramid. It allows learning to happen, but it is also felt when it's not. Any questions? Okay. There are some pitfalls to this. We're all goosebumpy. Well, I am. And you're all going to leave going, I'm going to knock this out of the park. And then you're not, and we're going to wonder why. Well, this is the pitfalls. Some of them are our assumptions and biases that we bring. None of us are free of these, right? We have all been raised with other human beings, and because we've been raised with other human beings, we have assumptions about folks. Not just about maybe who a person is or what a person brings, but also our own ability to connect with that person. That is an assumption, and that is a bias you might have. We all have triggers, right? I can knock it out of the park when kids are telling me to fuck off. I love that. I think that's why when I worked in corrections, I worked with boys, because they're that, right? I'm speaking very gendered, but if you've been in a group of teenage girls and a group of teenage boys, one of them's telling you to fuck off and the other one's kind of whining and being mean, and I struggle with that. Whining is a trigger for me. I know it is. My dog whines. I don't know how I got a whiny dog, and I love my dog, but at 7 o'clock in the morning when she's whining for food, I feel like throttling her, right? I will be 90 years old if I'm lucky to live that long, and someone in the old folks' home will be whining beside me, and I'll want to hit them with my cane, right? I'm not going to stop being triggered. My job and what recovery is and what strength and resilience is recognizing you're triggered and doing something about it, right? Once we understand our triggers, they lose their power. So I can hear whining, and I can be like, I'm out. I'm not doing this anymore. My trigger is not going to control me. In trauma, all the triggers are controlling. Know yours. Burnout, it's a big one. We work too hard, most of us, right? We don't look after ourselves enough. But we are the most important tool in the toolkit. So if you only have a day, should you support the caregiver around the kid or the kid? It's the caregiver, right? And you're all caregivers. Not knowing the challenges the youth has faced, not recognizing concerns as trauma-based, reacting to lava, these are going to be pitfalls. And then critically, we start taking things personally, right? What does that mean? We read lava as directly related to us. And sometimes it's hard when they say things like, you're the worst. And it's like, oh man. And it's hard to sort of take a step back and go, I don't really think they mean that. Sometimes the lava is very interesting. I once had a guy I triggered in session probably, and this was an adult male, a homicide detective, which was rather interesting. And that night he sent me an incredibly sexually explicit text, which was interesting. I know. What was fascinating is when I sought supervision on that, because I was like, this is making me a little uncomfortable, everybody told me to fire him. Everybody said he crossed a boundary. And my brain went, yeah, but that's lava, right? And so how do we move past lava? And so I sat down with him the next day and said, so the text, not super okay. But let's talk about what was going on that made you send it, because I don't think you want to have sex with me. I think you're trying to push me away. And that's exactly what he was doing, right? And it was awkward and weird and super uncomfortable. And he cried, and I was awkward. But that's not taking it personally, even if the person is like, whoa, I'm the sexiest, fantastic woman in the world. I'm like, no, I'm probably not. This is probably what he does to everybody to push them away, right? Being told to fuck off is maybe easier. But it's all lava that we can take personally, right? And so if you're starting to feel like, I can't make a difference, or this person doesn't like me, or this kid just doesn't want to be here, or this adult is never going to be successful, chances are you're taking something personally, right? When you start to let assumptions get in the way, when you're not recognizing stress and you just keep trying harder as opposed to get curious about trying differently, not recognizing when your own stuff is coming up, and critically not recognizing when shame is hanging out. So here's the feeling we don't talk about. Shame. How many kindergarten teachers sing the verse, when you're shameful, when you know it, clap your hands? Right? We don't. Do you know what feeling goes with trauma? Shame. Every single time. Girl goes into a party, gets sexually assaulted, and she thinks, what did I do? Right? A 2-year-old watches their parents fight, and they think, I must be doing something wrong. In particular, between the ages of 4, 3, and 6, we have something called magical thinking. It's wicked, it's fun, it's super great. It makes us believe in Santa and unicorns and that we saw an elephant in the field in Guelph, right? But it also makes us believe if we step on a crack, we break our mother's back, right? And so when kids are in overwhelmingly stressful situations, they believe they are wrong. Not that they've done something wrong, that they are wrong. But we don't have an expression for shame. We talk about hanging your head in shame. Maybe the little guy does, right? You know what shame looks like in your classroom? Not showing up, regardless of age, kicking you in the shins, telling you to fuck off, and in really, really, really important, saying I'm stupid. Now, attunement is about validating their feelings. If I said, I'm sad, if I said to you right now, I'm feeling really sad, how many of you are going to say, oh, Kristen, what's making you sad, right? Beautiful, attunement, fantastic, I love it. If I said, I'm stupid, how many of you are going to say, no, Kristen, you're not? All of you, to be honest. As soon as we get shame, we react to it. And you know what you need to say in that moment? Oh, Kristen, what's making you feel stupid? Because there's an answer. How many of you felt like you were connecting with somebody and having that conversation, and then they said something like, no one likes me, and you said, of course they do, and then the conversation feels like they're distant and lost, and you're not talking to them anymore. Because their shame monster said, see, they don't know you. This is also why rewards don't always work. Right? Kids get the sticker on day 1, day 2 sticker, day 3 sticker, day 4 sticker. And on that night, the teacher says, you're amazing. If you do this tomorrow, you win the prize. And you know what the kid does tomorrow? Well, one probably doesn't come to school. But if they do, they set it on fire. Why? Not because they didn't want the reward. Because their shame monster that night said, you're no good. Show them you're no good. Paul's kiddo, right? Waiting for a reason to get out. Why? Not because he doesn't like the school, not because he doesn't like the teacher, right? Not because he doesn't want to learn, but because he's just waiting to feel stupid and he doesn't want to sit with it anymore. Shame is the #1 driver of lava and the one we never talk about. And it is everywhere. This picture, by the way, just so you know, I get kids and adults to draw their shame monster. This is a kid whose mom came into care after, he came into care after mom found his mom in a bathroom. unconscious, he phoned 911. That's pretty amazing. But that was mom's last chance with her addiction and getting her kids back. All the kids never saw mom again. Shame takes over moms at that time, and they stop visiting. People always say, how could moms not go visit their kids? And I'm like, because they have to carry their shame monster into that room. And that kiddo said that when he was having big fights in the hallway, and I said, what's this picture about? And he said, the blood on the top is all the people I'm going to hurt in my future, and the blood on the bottom is all the people I've hurt in my past. Is this kid a sociopath? No. Did he believe no one was ever going to help him be something different? Yes. Right? That's all shame is. It's this overwhelming feeling like I'm not good enough. And then look at the way our system perpetuates it. You can come to school if you're good, right? You can sit in my class if you're doing what I tell you to. Not that I think you're saying that directly, but that's what they think, right? And so when we start to shift to say, how do you feel safe in here? Because I bet you don't. And when I hear I'm stupid, we go, okay, bud, sounds like this one's triggering you a little bit. How about we just start with number one and I help you? And then when they get number one, you say, see, you're not as stupid as you think you are. That's okay. That's the reassurance that you can give them. Any questions on that? It's big. Shame. Watch for it. You okay? You okay? Okay. And I'll just say sometimes it's a shame bug. You can see some of our little learning concerns here. This kid's actually 10. Spelling not his forte. What does it say to you, buddy? I'm stupid, I'm an idiot, I'm dumb, no one loves me. Right? So Paul, if you have 7 weeks with a kid, teach them they might be wrong about this. It's a good place to start. So what do our kiddos need? Right? I think you know by now. They need models of vulnerability. We are not perfect. We make mistakes. We yell at our husband for nachos. We get it. Right? And it's true. When my folks feel like I understand them at their worst, and not because I'm like, I get you at the worst, but I tell a story about nachos, people immediately start to feel safer with me. Not because I've done anything other than show that I can be vulnerable, right? Vulnerability is a superpower. It is also completely taken away from you if you've had trauma, right? And so that is one of the things we want to model. We model curiosity, strength, compassion, good enough regulation. Your number one tool is curiosity. It's not whatever is you've read in the book or the toolkit or anything like that. It's, can I get curious about what's going on for me, what's going on for them, what are the pressures in the pyramid? That's my number one tool. It's for that you as educators to get to know them as individuals, right? We're not one size fits all. Yes, trauma looks the same in most people. People think trauma is complicated. It's like, nope. When you take a step back and go, what is this person, how does this person show me their pyramid's about to crumble? And what are the pressures? And what do they look like when it falls apart? You'll start to see we're all pretty similar in that regard. But as individuals, we bring unique strengths, we bring unique pressures, and if we can get curious about those, we can make real differences for folks. We want to set expectations. One of the things we do with trauma is we often reduce expectations. You know, you can only come to school half a day, right? You can only do the general level courses. You can only do, keep naming it, keep naming it, keep naming it, right? Was being able to say, I think you can do this, but we're not there yet. How do we get you there? And that may be about their curriculum, it may be about their behavior, but we set expectations that they can be better than they think they are. For you to look for strengths wherever, whenever you can, and for you to challenge your own assumptions that might be getting in the way of creating that psychological safety they need. Yes?
Did you just say you lose the ability to be vulnerable?
With trauma. Yes.
So that's really interesting because it makes me think about, you know, the media coverage when there's some sort of sensational crime that's happened, and then they say, and he didn't show any remorse.
Didn't show it. So where does remorse lie on the pyramid? Pro-social regulation. That's pro-social regulation. So imagine, I like restorative practices. I don't like when they happen quickly, right? Because they can be really good. But if a kid does not feel safe, they are not going to be able to have the vulnerability to say, I'm sorry, because they're not sure you're going to like them. Like, my kid can say, I'm sorry, because, like, if I say, you know, I was really upset with you today, they'll go, sorry, Mom, right? They can say that because they know it was about their behavior that I was upset with and not the person. Folks with trauma can't because they believe it's about the person. And so if they have to face somebody and apologize without any understanding that anybody gets anything about them or that they can be loved tomorrow, they won't. It's too much vulnerability, right? And so I have had more people ask me about 5-year-olds that can't show remorse and whether or not they're sociopaths. I'm serious. It sounds funny. But adoptive parents in particular, right, will say, is my kid going to be a sociopath? And it's like, no, that'd be a weird lottery to win. And it's about as likely as winning a lottery, right? But because your kid not feel safe enough, can't manage all the stuff in the pyramid to get to a place where they can say, I can carry this shame and still say I'm sorry, that's probably where we're at. If I believe, if I step on a foot, and I'm not going to step on this one, I feel super bad about that. And I would immediately be like, oh my God, I'm so sorry, right? Because I know I'm not a horrible human being. I just accidentally stepped on her foot. Guilt is fantastic. Guilt drives us to fix things, right? But if we are carrying guilt that is not ours, if we're carrying guilt because our parent told us we sucked, if we're carrying guilt because we believe our brother went into care because we didn't put a diaper on him, right? That is guilt that is not ours. It turns into shame, and then it makes us believe that I stepped on her toe because I'm awful. That's much harder to apologize for. Did that answer that?
Yes, it just makes me think that maybe there's some education in the system that could help all of us better understand.
Yeah, I think probably Andrew and I are on the same page on that. Yeah. So it is systemic. And so systemic. Why is it systemic? Because who do we shame the most, right? Through the way our systems are set up, through our expectations are set up, to the way we expect folks to learn, even down to the curriculum that we teach, right? We shame the non-white kids in the room, right? And then we wonder why. I had a teacher once say to me, and I will not name her or where she was from because it wasn't the best comment, but said, these kids come towards me with hate and you're asking me to attune to them? And in my head I was like, this is a white teacher and those kids will be black. And I asked her, and I said, what are those kids like? And of course, they were 4 black kids coming towards her. What's getting in the way is her assumptions around her own safety with that person. What are they feeling? Shame, right? And so when we set these expectations that are based on what one good enough kid is supposed to be able to do, all of our kids that are marginalized for whatever reason, whether it's through race or culture or religion or just poverty or intergenerational trauma, they start to feel like they're failing us. It has to be flipped. We have to realize we're failing them, right? Not because we want to, but because our curiosity isn't enough to be able to support what they need, right? And that curiosity starts with how do we create safe environments for kiddos, all kiddos, regardless of what they look like, how old they are, right? And their parents. So how do we do this? How do we build these windows? It's through us. Remember, the most powerful antidotes to things like shame and adversity are your compassion and your curiosity and your patience. Rome wasn't built in a day, neither was a brain, but we know we can fix them. It just doesn't happen overnight. But again, we never know the moment that's going to make the difference. Incorporate strategies that build the window by increasing capacity at the bottom. How do I help your window grow through understanding things like my sensory environment, and whether or not you've slept, and whether or not you've had anything to eat, and whether or not you can manage stress when it comes up. And then we focus on strengths to lighten the load on top. How do I help you learn that math differently, or show your good stuff in English, or how do I help you learn to share with a friend if you are 4, right? We build routines around connection, even small ones. I had a VP once that was at one of my son's schools, and I saw him running once from the parking lot. And I'm like, Rob, what are you doing? He's like, I don't want to miss my entry. And what he would do is he would stand by the door and he'd fist pump every single person that was coming into the room, right? And he was running because it was such a strong routine. And he was right, because if he wasn't there one day, my guess is a lot of kids would feel a little dysregulated coming into the school, right? Remember that shame is improved when structures are put in place that allow every single individual to meet their potential, right? And that's what we were just talking about. We pay careful attention to safety derailing concerns, things like toxic language, unrecognized burnout, power imbalances, and assumptions. And then you look after yourself so you can look after them. Because trauma is super contagious, right? Oh, I'm just going to give you this. Strengths lifted off. I forgot I put that in there. Stresses and challenges, weigh it down. So, I have a challenge for you, okay? The whiteboard test. I stole this from an educator in Boston whose name I forget, which is terrible. I'm going to try and find out his name. It was really great. but it was years ago and I suck at names. I could describe him. He was a sort of larger man. Like I could describe him perfectly, but I couldn't tell you his name. But the whiteboard is a brilliant thing. So you put all the names up of the folks that you're supporting. And I will challenge the ECE folks in the room to not necessarily put the kids, but the caregivers of the kids. Because here's an interesting thing about kindergartens and little preschoolers. We get really good at tuning to the child. Our toxicity and our assumptions actually come with the parents of those child, right? And they need our safety probably more than the kiddos do if we want to see change. But the whiteboard, put the names of the folks in your world, right? Whether you're a teacher or whether it's colleagues or whether it's things that the people you are navigating. And for every person that you think you have a good relationship and that you feel efficacy about, am I doing my job well with this individual? Whatever your job is, erase that name. The names that are left are triggering you for some reason. The names that are left are bringing up your own stuff. The names that are left are making you feel bad at your job. The names that are left are probably the ones that need you the most. The other names all probably have somebody else they're going home to, right? And so challenge yourself to get curious about how to look at that person differently. You are spinning in their lava, I guarantee it, right? I know who's on my whiteboard, and when I see that name, I go, right? Because it takes a lot of energy. But then I go, I'm not going to feel judged by her today. I know that's what she does when she's feeling unsafe, and she does. I'm the only one of her practitioners that has any rooting in science. Everybody else is like, wow, just doing all sorts of stuff that really she shouldn't pay for. But the only one she constantly questions is me, right? And so I have to always go, she is questioning me because she is afraid that if my stuff doesn't work, she's a failure, right? And so I just have to take a deep breath and stay curious. And some days it's hard, but creating safety for her is worth it, right? That's your whiteboard. And it's so important to do because here's the thing, folks. Trauma is super contagious, right? It hangs out with us. Lava lands on us, right? We start to take things personally. We start to feel overwhelmed. And then we start to come home and yell at our husbands for nachos. That's the way it works. This is us. Now, this is a slide related to a child, but adults are just big children, right? They really are. The patterns that their brains develop, they did not develop at 25. They developed at 5, right? And we're just seeing them in a bigger package. But look at us. As all those kiddos, big or little, are showing those behaviors, we start to have difficulty sleeping. We start to struggle to stay on our windows. We start to become more reactive. And down below, we just start to shut them out. Feel like there's nothing I can do anymore, right? We hope they move to Florida. They don't. They do drop out, but we don't feel very good about those ones, right? And so how do you make sure you're not here, right? Woo! My thing was just really excited there for a second. I'm going to pop this slide back on, but I'm also going to tell you a story, and then I'm going to actually let you go. Woo! I'm echoey here. Before I describe, I'm going to describe it first. So when you think about yourself, please know what worries you and where you're struggling. That's vulnerability. Can I look inside and be like, I'm good here, I'm not good here? And not from a place of judgment, right? That's what we do to ourselves all the time. Like, I suck at this. I want you to be like, this is hard for me, and I want to get curious as to why, right? Can we give ourselves permission to be struggling at times, right? Can you ask for help? Can you work as a team? You have colleagues, you have supports. Can you show some vulnerability to say, hey, do you have any ideas about how to help Eddie? Because Eddie's a pain in my ass, I got to tell you. And how can we work together? Not toxically, but with curiosity. Know your symptoms of burnout. I'm going to come back to that one in a second. Know your symptoms of burnout. Early detection is the key, right? If we want to make sure we're not going off work because we're sick and we don't ever know how to get back, figure out what makes you feel burnt out now, right? And start to look after yourself. Change your language. Think positively. Focus on the strengths, not the weaknesses, in yourself and in those that you support. Take care of your pyramid. Support the bottom. Hang out with the people you love, right? If you're not liking the person you love right now, get curious about what's getting in the way, because chances are you're just in that pattern of shaky pyramids. Actively engage in self-care. Little bits of things add up. Watch your shame monster, right? As it's a fascinating relationship between shame, self-compassion, and self-care. If our shame monster is big, we can't be self-compassionate. But if we're not self-compassionate, we actually don't engage in self-care. And so we have to be able to, in order to look after ourselves, also be kind to ourselves. And then never forget the difference you make. I'm going to tell 2 stories, okay? One is a true story about burnout. It is funny. Do I have time? I do. It's funny when I yell at Gord for nachos, right? It's good. It's funny. Gord's a big adult and he can handle it. My worst burnout was not with Gord, right? At the time, it was my 20-month-old daughter. Now, what was interesting is I used to work in hospitals and systems and corrections, and then after my 3rd kid was born, I was so frustrated with the system and the limits of it, I was like, screw it, I'm starting my own practice. And I thought that was great. I was 5 minutes away from my kids' daycare and my kids' school. Before, I was working an hour away and I commuted. I thought I hated my commute. But about 6 months in to working 5 minutes away from my children, I was downstairs in the basement with my 18-month-old daughter, 20-month-old daughter. I had no idea what she did. I know what I did. I know I started yelling at her, and I knew I couldn't stop. I was completely out of control. My husband came down, grabbed my daughter, and said, get out, right? And so I left. Now I had nowhere to go. I don't run, right? And I sat in the van, and I started to cry. Now I should thank my parents in that moment that that was my reaction, right? Because I had 2 choices in that moment. I could carry the shame of what I'd just done and bury it to my shoes, right? I can feel it instantly. My daughter's still my most challenging child, and every once in a while that voice in my head says, do you think you did this? Think you created this? Right? And that's what we do with shame. We hide it, we bury it, and then it comes out as lava, right? Or I can say, holy man, I never want to get there again. And what do I need to do differently? That's hard. And for most of our folks, they need someone guiding us through that, right? To be able to say, I hated myself in that moment, but I never want to be there and I believe I can change. You know what I realized I'd lost, folks? My commute. Isn't that crazy? I had forgotten that by the time I was like halfway through my commute, I'd processed all my cases, talked to myself, and then was singing Bon Jovi on the radio, right? And I'd lost all that, replaced it with nothing, and the victim of that was my daughter. But really, the victim was my own mental health. And so take that step back and get curious about yourself, because you are needed. There are 2 places that I always say I like to train the most, and I do trainings all over the place. One is 0 to 6. Because boy, oh boy, the patterns kids learn in 0 to 6 carry them for life, right? Unless someone's going to start to get curious about changing it. But I recently attended a graduation for an adult education center because my kiddo graduated. And I wept through the entire thing because every single one of those individuals that got up and graduated had these remarkable stories of resilience and bravery and recovery. And every single one of them thanked somebody at the school. Talked about how important the school was, talked about how they never could have done this if such and such hadn't believed that they could do it. One of them talked about how somebody in the school, I don't know who, thought she might be good at mechanics, and she's graduating with this mechanic thing because they saw her puttering on something, right? And every single one of them talked about how different their life was going to be. And I guarantee you every single one of them has a bag load of trauma that they carried with them. So you're going to clap for me. You should really clap for you, right? Because I'm going to go home, and you're going to go hang out with them on Tuesday, right? If I can help in the future, call me. Andrea knows where to find me. I'm not Batman. Well, I mean, that makes me sound like Batman. Only Andrea can find me. Everybody knows where I am. But if you start, I will just leave you with, if you start to feel like you can't, do it, right? Get curious about how you can do things differently, and get curious about what you need to support yourselves, and hang out with that person beside you and say, how do we start to look differently at this person? You might not win, you might not make a difference, right? But you will keep trying, and that's what's so important. I'm done. Look at this. 10:56.